Welcome to Violin Adventures number 183. Now this week was different from all other weeks. I had a good experience of just going with the flow. There were interruptions all week long, and you can look at them as interruptions or you can look at them as opportunities. And I enjoyed looking at them as opportunities. We started the week off going to Knoxville, and we didn't find what we were looking for, but we ended the day at a beautiful Seder full of kosher food that was absolutely delicious. By the way, this isn't sponsored, but Copitas in Knoxville is delicious. Then someone passed away and there was a funeral. I so much enjoyed playing at that funeral in the mountains of Irvine, the beautiful lush scenery, and everything is coming to life here. It was a beautiful day. But I was going out to do some recording and to get some pictures when here comes the lawnmowers. They come once a week and you can't record when they're out there. So I came back in and realized, well, the shop could use a little sweeping, and in the process I found two things I want to show you that I completely forgot about. So here we go. So over here is this organ corner, which I have neglected this corner, and I thought, now is a good time to just sweep around and check on these pedals because they're the ones that aren't quite working correctly. And so while I was cleaning that, I came across this box, which is clearly from an auction, and I completely forgot about it. Look at that. Just a beautiful inkwell, and I'm going to polish this up. And then here's another one. I think you would lay your pen across there, and here's the pen. So that goes like that, and I don't even remember these. Then underneath, well, look at this. These are all fountain pens and dip pens. And then these are mechanical pencils. This organ has had a little bit of trouble with a humming on the pedals when I turn the stops for the pedals on. So I thought I'll give it a good clean, get rid of all the dust, and put it back in, and we'll see if it helped or not. The pedals are not humming. I am so thrilled. This had a hum whenever I put any of the stops down for the pedals in. There's no hum. This morning I was going out to do a little filming, and opening the back door here to the little porch was a little tiny turtle. He's going to wink at me. Get ready. Okay, here's our little guy. I looked him up, and he's called a pond slider. They can live up to 50 years, and they get a whole lot bigger. And so I'm down here by the creek. I'm going to put him out here where he belongs, and he definitely wants to get out. Look at that. Say opportunity after opportunity. clock sits here on top of this watchmaker's desk, and it has decided to stop working. So let's see if we can coax it. Oh, I hear it ticking. Maybe it's gonna work. Back here are all the little hammers. Now this one is here next to the apothecary cabinet. Let's see if it wants to work. Now this one is over here by our smaller violins. Okay, here's another clock, and it's just about ready to ring. So let's see what it sounds like. Okay, we're reading from Violins and Violinists by Franz Farga, and we're going to finish the story. We heard about Mr. Tarisio gathering up all these instruments, trading them, giving the shiny instruments for a trade for the old instruments, and then he went to Milan to visit a famous violin maker. And he entered looking like a tramp, very weather beaten and clothes all ragged. So this is where we left off. Let's find out what happened as he entered the shop. Nevertheless, he decided to enter. He asked Monsieur Aldrich whether he wanted to buy any Cremonese violins. Aldrich tried to size up the shabby stranger, whom he suspected of being a swindler. Which in a way, yes, a little bit. He was all the more surprised when the visitor took out of his rucksack a beautiful Nicola Amati, a small-sized instrument in very good condition, but without fingerboard and tailpiece. Aldrich, trying to hide his joy, examined the violin carefully and asked what he wanted for it. Tarisio quoted a rather high price. Aldrich had been hoping that the seller was ignorant of the true value of his violin and asked to see the other instruments as well. Tarisio put them one by one on the counter. A Maggini, a Francesco Ruggieri, a Storiani, and 2 Grancinis. After scrutinizing them thoroughly, Aldrich said that he would like to buy them all, offering a not too high price, which he raised only by half after much haggling. Tarisio was disappointed. He had hoped for much more profit, for the instruments were really good. But in the end, he told himself that it was his own fault, because he had not bothered about his personal appearance, nor about the get-up of his wares. Aldrich might have offered a much higher price if the violins had been offered him in a playable condition, in luxury cases, by a well-dressed man arriving in a coach, and not by a tramp who looked as if he were glad to make any profit at all from his instruments. Tarisio decided to learn from this experience and to take good care of appearances in future. He returned to Italy, bought a number of good violins with the money he had received from Aldrich, and turned up in Paris again 2 months later. This time he appeared as a well-groomed, fashionably dressed man. He hired a coach and made the round of all the famous Paris violin makers calling out violins, chenots, gons, and thebaus, and lo and behold, they outbid one another in their efforts to obtain his instruments. For 30 years, Tarisio conducted his business in this way. Every year he went to France, always taking most valuable instruments with him. It is a safe guess that during that time he took more than 1,000 master instruments out of Italy. His amazing skill in discovering such violins increased as time went by. He traveled all over Italy, had his spies everywhere, exchanged new, inferior violins for old, damaged master instruments, visited innumerable auctions, and bribed many moneylenders to ask their customers for old violins. All the first-rate masterpieces he added to his private collection, and these he never took to Paris but used as bait to attract his patrons. I have a Strat so wonderful that one must adore it on one's knees, he whispered. It has never been played, which is a mistake right there. It's as new as when he left the master's workshop. Perhaps I'll bring it with me next year just to let you admire it. He raved about his violin to Violin and Gond for 20 years, until one day the former exclaimed, I suppose you want us to wait for that violin as the Jews wait for their Messiah. From that day, the violin makers of Paris called it the Messiah violin, which no one would ever see. By the way, the Messiah violin is on display in the Ashmolean Museum, and I did see it about 20 years ago. I was not impressed as far as the idea that it has never been played, and the bridge that was on it was not cut properly, so it couldn't have a good sound. I'm afraid it probably doesn't have a good sound, and that's why it's all closed up in a case. After some time, Tarisio extended his business trips to England, where his visits were anticipated with great excitement. In 1851, the violin maker and dealer John Hart introduced him to James Golding, one of the foremost London violin collectors. Tarisio was asked to take his seat in the center of a salon hung with yellow silk. Glass cases were arranged along the walls, and in them were cases made of red Morocco leather impressed with gold, containing the precious Cremonese instruments. The collector had hardly taken a violin from its case before Tarisio named its maker and the date of origin without even touching the instrument. And this feat he repeated again and again with unerring instinct. James Golding was almost appalled. Stooping to John Hart, he whispered, That man smells a violin as the devil smells a lost soul. Yet he had no time even to look at the instruments properly. Tarisio, however, knew most of these instruments very well indeed, because he had brought them to Paris or London himself. Besides, his infallible eye could distinguish at a glance which was a Bergonzi, a Guadagnini, or a Grancino. It was also in London that he met another collector, Charles Reed, to whom the musical world owes interesting information on the famous Spanish Stradivari cello. And here's the story of the cello. One day, Reed reports, the well-known Paris violin maker Georges Chenot went to Spain to have a look around for old instruments. Okay, this is the second part of the story. I would normally stop here, but since we have a little extra time, we'll finish up this little section on Tarisio. And we're talking here about a cello that Mr. Chenot, a famous violin maker, found. His journey was a failure until he came to Madrid. There, however, he visited Ortega, the violin maker. Beside the door, Chenot saw the cracked belly of a cello baking in the glowing sun. Chenot rubbed his eyes to make sure he was not dreaming. The magnificent auburn varnish told him that this was the belly of a Stradivari cello. He rushed into the shop and bought the belly for 40 pesetas. Ortega told him that the cello in question had been owned by an old lady, and he had been given the instrument in order to repair the belly. This job, however, appeared to him too difficult and not worth his while, because the old lady was very mean. So he had simplified matters by taking off the old belly and replacing it by an ordinary new one. Chenot took the original belly with him to Paris, mended it skillfully, and hung it up in his shop. When Tarisio entered the shop, he stopped dead in front of the belly, which his sharp eyes had recognized at once as made by Stradivari. He did not give up until Chenot sold him the belly for 1,000 francs. Then he immediately set off for Madrid and asked Ortega for the address of the old lady who owned the cello. When he had called on her and inquired about the cello, he received the typically Spanish reply, "Señor, this cello is yours." Tarisio, however, knew that this sounded too good to be true. It was one of those polite Spanish phrases which must not be taken at face value. After a few words of thanks, Tarisio therefore asked the price, and now the old lady showed herself to be a shrewd business woman. After endless negotiations, Tarisio purchased the cello for 4,000 pesetas. Overjoyed, he embarked on his return journey to Paris. In order to travel faster and more comfortably with his prey, he boarded a merchant cutter in the Gulf of Biscay. As the ship approached the coast of Brittany, a terrible storm broke out. Enormous waves washed the deck, and the ship was tossed about violently. Tarisio had sought refuge in the hold, embracing his cello case with both arms. The night passed. The gale calmed down on the following day, and Tarisio arrived in Paris safe and sound after all. Chenot undertook the job of fixing the original belly to the body, and shortly afterwards the beautiful cello which Stradivari had once made for his Spanish quintet was sold to an English collector for 20,000 francs. Tarisio himself brought the instrument to London. When he had delivered it, he called upon his friend Reed and told him the story of his stormy crossing. During that night, he said, I really thought that the end of the Spanish cello had come. Not a word about his own end, which had seemed so near. Only a true collector would react in this way. Among the vast numbers of instruments which Tarisio sold to collectors and dealers in England and France during those 30 years, there were a good many excellent master violins. He sold them with great reluctance. Sometimes he cried and moaned when he had to part with his treasure for good. But he never ceased to keep an eye on it from afar, waiting for a lucky chance to buy it back. In this he succeeded several times. In Paris, Tarisio kept up the appearance of a wealthy man for business purposes, but in Milan he lived in retirement like a mole. No one was allowed to enter his home, where the doors were secured with iron bars and chains when he had to go on a journey. Even the neighbors had no idea what he did in his home. One night, he had been seen climbing up to his attic. Then he remained invisible for several days until the neighbors told the authorities. 2 local officials were sent to force open the door. Tarisio was found lying on a tattered sofa, fully dressed, clasping 2 violins against his chest as if in a spasm. The body was already stiff and cold. Apart from the sofa, the furniture of the room consisted of nothing but a working table with some carpenter's tools and 2 chairs. Yet the room was so full that it was impossible to take a single step without knocking against something. Violins were suspended from the ceiling or hanging on the walls. Half a dozen cellos and a double bass covered with sheets were heaped in one corner, and the other 3 corners were filled with violin cases. A subsequent investigation showed that this veritable treasure chest of a room contained half a dozen Stradivari violins and several violas and cellos by the same master. Besides, there was a large double bass by Gasparo da Salo and over 100 violins by other great masters. The authorities, however, were not interested in these treasures. They were looking for money and jewelry, and at last a thick bundle of securities, banknotes, and an appreciable sum of gold coins were found in a mattress. The money was put into safe custody, the body taken away, and the flat sealed. The authorities then made it known publicly that they were looking for the legal heirs of the late citizen of Milan, Mr. Tarisio. Okay, so that is the end of our story about Mr. Tarisio. But there's other stories in here of other violin makers. The Hebrew Minute. During Passover week, we don't eat any leaven, and so here's a delicious recipe I want to share with you. First, you soak the matzah in milk. Then you whip up some whipping cream and add some honey. Then you melt the chocolate, and then you just start to layer till it gets higher and higher and you use up all your ingredients, and it's absolutely delicious. Freddie wants to chat.
Hi, I'm Freddie, and here's some more video of checking on the bees. We just have one hive right now, but they're doing really good, bringing in lots of pollen. So if you have any projects you're working on, send them in. Bye!
There you have it, a whole week of opportunities. It was a nice break, and Lord willing, we'll be back next week with repairs and making. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for all your wonderful comments and your thumbs up. And don't forget, we have a 200th episode coming up. I've got a few entries. Send in a picture of whatever you're working on. And this is for anybody that watches. And we'll see you next time. Bye.